Hello, this episode is the full extended version, which would usually only be released on Patreon. But I felt this conversation so helpful to people and meant so much to my Patreon community that I wanted to release it to everyone at this time. If you enjoy the podcast, please consider joining us on Patreon for dozens more episodes of unreleased bonus content, monthly online events, and a private chat. We are a warm, supportive community and it really helps to support the project. Find us on patreon.com/The Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast. I'm Jo Hickey Hall, and I'm really delighted to welcome my guest this time, Brother Richard. Welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you.
There's so much I want to ask you, and I think probably won't get through all of it this time, but you are a Capuchin Franciscan Priest-Friar. Perhaps
Right.
Could you start by telling viewers, if they're not already familiar with you, what that role encompasses,
Sure.
please?
So I'm a Roman Catholic monastic. So the order that I belong to is the Franciscan Order that was founded by St. Francis of Assisi. He founded it in 1209. He died in 1226. So it was sort of high Middle Ages was when he was there, and he founded it as a renewal of monastic life within the Catholic faith. His ideal was to return to an understanding of simplicity, poverty, what we call cosmic fraternity, which basically means the brotherhood, sisterhood of all creation, and then also compassionate service. But all of that was to come out of deep meditative experience and work. And so the Capuchins are a branch of the Franciscan Order, and we stress particularly contemplative practice. The word Capuchin comes from in the robes that we wear. We have a very large hood, and a large hood in Italian is a cappuccini. So that's where the word Capuchin comes from. But most people would know the word as a sort of a derivation or an origin of cappuccino. And it was one of our brothers who was involved with the creation of the cappuccino many years ago. So that's our great gift to Western civilization along the way. So we've all kinds of connections. And it does mean a most beautiful thing, which is that the drinking of coffee can be a devotional act. So that's always a good thing. But for ourselves nowadays, I currently live in Ireland. I live in Dublin in Ireland, though we are international. We travel around quite a bit. And my work currently is a mixture of kind of priestly work, the ordinary work that people would just think when they hear the word priest, parish, that kind of work, but also teaching, giving retreats, teaching meditation, writing, and a little bit of reaching into the kind of folklore, paranormal end of things as well, because it's been a long, long apostolate of the Capuchins. We're traditionally involved in this whole area, and some of us receive training within it. So that's why I end up at your threshold today.
Well, this is it, because you've imparted your wisdom in a few interviews that I've listened to, and I do find it very intriguing. And immediately I'm drawn to ask you about what those very first teachings would have been, because if you're going back to kind of the Middle Ages, do you have writings and teachings that have come down from those times that kind of point you in a direction when you're working with entities? Yeah. And we'll get onto that, but yeah, do you have that within your working practice?
We have stuff that goes back thousands of years. And so the monastic tradition within the Christian faith goes back to the very first generation of Christianity, and in many ways would have been built upon some of the earlier Jewish understanding as well, Christianity coming out of Judaism. Yeah. So there is a long, long tradition of recognizing that we are part of a creation that involves other, let's use the modern phrase, non-human intelligences, and we would call them, spiritual entities as well, and that we exist as part of a great ladder of being, which goes from the very highest, the divine, right the way down to inanimate matter itself, though we would say there is a consciousness even in inanimate matter. Everything has its particular form of soul or divine existence, divine with a small d, in that sense. And that on that ladder of being, there are the creatures that range from the corporeal right the way through to the incorporeal, to the mixture of matter and spirit that we find particularly in our own being, human being, but also various other kind of, let's say, elements as opposed to elementals that go to make up that full ladder, which would include, at the very highest and most positive, the angelic, and at the very lowest and most negative, the demonic, but every possible thing in between as well.
And so in the beginning, did they have some kind of categorization to talk about the way in which people interact and the way that they might have interacted?
Yes, there was all kinds of categorization, and sometimes naturally there was even dispute over how you categorize these things, right the way to the present day. So some of the greatest kind of writers within the earliest tradition would have recognized, they would have started first of all with angelology, as we would call it, the angelical realm, and kind of working with the understanding of the angels. So the sort of classic understanding of the angels is a breaking up into what we call the nine choirs. So you would starting at the top, you have seraphim, then cherubim, thrones, dominions, principalities, powers, virtues, archangels, and angels, all the way down, with the understanding that an angel as such is the title of a job rather than the name of the creature that undertakes it. So angelos in Greek means messenger. And any non-corporeal spiritual entity that is charged with a message, with a divine message of some description, is de facto an angelos, someone that is bringing a message. But within the understanding of what an angel is itself, it is a point of independent, pure consciousness, spirit, and will, that has various functions and various ways of being, ranging from the lowest, the more near the earth, the end of things, the what we would call the angels themselves, right the way through to the great seraphim, the beings of fire and pure love that are almost at the very kind of top of the ladder. And then you would also have had debate and conversation around even the Fae themselves, and sort of what the good people were and are. And there would still be conversations around what they may be and what they are. So traditionally, that was kind of split in a number of directions. There were those who kind of went with, look, there are only angels and demons, and so we place the Fae within those realms, depending on what they're doing, depending on their activity. Then there would be those that would say, actually, no, there's probably, a third piece in between. And that kind of understanding came from the idea that if you believe in a divine creator of infinite mind and infinite compassion, then you can't say that you can have an idea that the divine creator can't, because that would make you greater than the divine creator. So therefore, the elemental end of things, the sort of Fae consciousnesses must exist at least in the mind of the divine. And that was the argument that someone like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis would have used when asked by other Orthodox Christians how it was that they could write about fairies and gods and naiads and dryads and all of that sort of stuff. And Tolkien famously said, when he was asked, do you believe in elves? He said, well, I believe that God believes in elves, because I couldn't have the idea if it wasn't already in the divine mind for me to have. So then we're into the idea of what we would call eidolons, or entities that are mental constructs or projections of mental constructs. There's all of those. And then you would also have had, going right back to the patristic idea, the idea that the Fae were their own people, and that as their own people, we actually had a call to share with them the good news. And there is a wonderful story from one of the lives of the earliest monks, St. Anthony the Great, who goes into the desert of Egypt and is living there, a form of meditative life, hermit life. And he encounters he encounters many different kinds of beings, but the two kinds, I suppose, that are more pursuant to the interests of those watching this, he encounters a centaur, which through prayer he reveals as being a demon sent to frighten him. So with prayer, he dismisses it, it's gone. And then he encounters what we would call a faun, I suppose, the kind of goat-hooved and horned, short little person. And he begins to pray, presuming this is a demon, and it doesn't go away. So he asks, well, what are you? And they explain, we're just another people, just like you. And in the past, people have worshipped us as gods or have thought of us as, supernatural, etc. But we're not. We're natural. We just exist in a different way to you. We're the people of the wild. The wild was given to us, is the way they put it. And so the satyr or faun that he encounters, they have a long conversation and they part with mutual blessing. So there's that idea of, there are others, and divine grace is communicated to them in another way, perhaps. But when we encounter them, we're called to share the good news in that way as well. And then in our own Celtic Christian tradition, we would have had quite a lot of experience in dealing with the problems that occur when people, don't observe their manners when they're out and about. And sometimes some of the brothers that I've lived with and worked with would have dealt with things like, I suppose traditionally it would have been known as elf shot or that sort of stuff, where people had experienced problems either through disturbing places that belong to the other people, or maybe trying to take power over them in a way that they were not happy with, etc. And so we have to this day rituals for the healing or the exorcising, specifically of elven or good people or the Shida or etc. That are separate to the stuff that we would use specifically for the demonic, which is a very different thing entirely.
That's absolutely amazing. There's a couple of things I want to ask you about there, and I really want to hear about the kinds of approaches that you would use that you just spoke about, specifically for beings of the fairy realm. But I also am very intrigued by this potential documentation of, I don't know whether it was documented or not, around.
Let me show you something.
Oh, yeah, please.
Let me show you. The book itself is a translation of one of the monastics whose job he was set by his superiors was to travel around Europe. And he was to investigate three different things: the apparitions of spirits, the whether or not there was any truth to whether vampires existed or not. He came down on the no on that, though he had some things around that perhaps vampiric stuff takes place, but through demonic possession or that sort of idea. And the third piece that he inquired into was what had happened to the house spirits of the Greek and Roman classical antiquity. And his basic teaching at the end, having traveled all over Europe and spoken to the various kind of people he'd encountered, was that the house spirits had effectively become the sort of the gnomes, the brownies, the kobolds, the fae, those kind of things, the tomtons, etc. So these documents exist and are really, really interesting in terms of the approach that was taken. He also was asked to investigate whether the darker forms of witchcraft were taking place. And his response to that was no, that this is generally being used by landowners to remove people from their land. An accusation of witchcraft could be placed against people, particularly women, to be able to move them on. And he charges the church with the charge of actually defending people against whom these various accusations are placed. and speaks particularly around the importance of recognizing kind of traditional healers, etc., and the work that they were doing. So very interesting as far back as I.
Yeah, what an amazing collection to have, and I must get a copy of that book too. So I'd love for you to share, and I'll share it on here.
I'll send you on the link and title. Yeah. It's a fascinating piece. But apologies for not being able to lay my hand on it here now. But it's I mean, there's an extraordinary archive of stuff that's there, and of course some of it would have been very technical and meant for those who are specifically working in this area, and would have presented the various kind of rites and rituals to be used to assist with all of this. Then there would have been those who were kind of just collecting stories, as we do to this day. I think that the podcasts have become the place where the stories are collected now very often, and people get to tell their story. But the monasteries particularly were very strong places of retaining chronicles, history, annals, all of that sort of stuff. The idea was to record everything. So, for example, one of the monasteries that I lived in for a number of years was up in Donegal in the northwest of the country there, which to this day would have a very strong and living kind of awareness of the sort of fairy faith aspect of the Irish tradition. I remember I was just there a couple of days and was chatting with one of the men who looked after the land that we have. We have a beautiful retreat centre there in the middle of about 165 acres of beautiful forest, and with the ocean in front. So it's a very wild place, very beautiful place. And anybody can go there to stay or to take time out. But I was chatting with the groundsman there, and his family have lived there for about 4 or 5 generations. And we were out walking around. He was showing me some of the land, and he was pointing out that we had not just a fairy hill, but we had a fairy castle on the grounds, which in the tradition up there is a large mound, but instead of just the mound with trees, it has large rocks that come out of the mound, sort of jagged rocks. Oh. And he said it was fairy castle, and I said, "Oh, that's interesting." And I said to him, "Do the people up there do they still take the fairies seriously? Do they believe in them?" And he said, "No, nobody believes in them anymore." And I said, "Oh, okay, fine." And then he turned around and with a typical Donegal smile, he said, "Sure, why would you believe in them when they're there?" He said, "They're just the neighbours. We avoid them and they avoid us." So I said, "Okay." And I later beautiful proof of that when there was a storm one night, and one of the trees that was on the fairy castle was blown down. An old tree was blown down, and most of the people in the area have wood burning stoves. Yeah. So the second a tree would come down, you'd have knock on the door straight away with people asking, "Could I take some wood, or could I take some of the tree?" We always said, of course, if it was wind falling. Nobody came to ask for that tree. The tree itself is still there in the field, slowly rotting back in. Okay. And after a couple of months, I said to him, "Seamus, how come nobody wants that?" He said, "Because it doesn't belong to us." And that was it. Yeah. It was theirs, so it was left for theirs, and nobody would take that wood into the house to be burned. So in very often unspoken ways, it's still very, very present. So you have this continuum of kind of how to live side by side in a kind of a respectful, courteous way, but with the understanding as well that these things had to be taken seriously. There was no question of sort of going out dancing with them sort of thing. The idea was that you recognized that they had, their own way of being, and you left them at it. And there was also the recognition that to interfere with that in any way could be very dangerous for human beings.
And it's wonderful to hear that. I love the fact that his role has gone through several generations, so that he's kind of carrying on that tradition and really knows that landscape. He's obviously been there since he was a kid, and that's beautiful. I wonder when you go to other places in the world, or when other friars and brothers come to stay in these places in Ireland, is there a shift there in kind of the way in which they relate to, because I'm imagining that Ireland is quite special in that way, but maybe there are other places that are still kind of hold these traditions and beliefs?
Well, I suppose I think it's there everywhere. I think if you sit long enough with people, if people know that you're open to listening and hearing their stories, and especially if you've developed a relationship of trust with people, that's when you'll hear the stories, And it's like everywhere else in the 21st century. Most people start off with, "Oh, that's all ridiculous. It's rubbish. Don't believe a thing about it," whatever. And then as you sit, you get that, well, actually, there was this strange thing, or there was this one time, or I remember my daughter said, or my grandmother used to say, or whatever, and it might be at one remove, and you can kind of notice that people will often put the story at one remove from them. It's a kind of a generation beyond. We don't think that way nowadays, but at the same time, I'm still, doing what they did. I think one of the things that is sad in the 21st century is that many people have either retained the customs without the understanding why the customs were there, or people have gone after, naturally, they're hungry for encounter or for connection or whatever you want to call it. And so they grab onto what they think might give connection, but without knowing the kind of rules or the courtesies that are really important in order to protect yourself and also to give respect to whatever the others are. And so both of those approaches can be problematic. And the difficulty then is if you've lost continuity or the kind of continuum of wisdom, it can be difficult. So, for example, in Donegal, there were lots of people who would have moved there for the beautiful place, the countryside, etc. They would want to be there, and they'd build their house, or they'd move into the local community or whatever, and were received very well. But the difficulty very often could be those kind of customs that they wouldn't know, that you weren't supposed to disturb, a lone tree in a field, that you weren't supposed to sleep under particular trees at particular times of the day, that that children under 7 could play around fairy forts, but children over 7 it was a danger for them to be there. There was all of these kind of things. And even the things of the customs as to if things were getting a bit stroppy with you, how to be able to make peace again, or if necessary, defend yourself. A lot of those things have been lost. And it's important, I think, if people are beginning to have interest in this area, that they observe just as much the warnings that are there, because the warnings have been gathered over centuries to allow people to be able to pass safely.
Very good advice. Can you offer any ideas around protection? I'm really interested to hear kind of what the Catholic, the Christian perspective is there on protection.
So obviously, that's the tradition I come from. So within that tradition, we would use holy water. We use salt, particularly what we call exorcised salt, which is salt that has been doubly blessed. So that salt is used, and particularly to protect houses or people or animals, for that matter. We would give the blessed salt to animals to eat if we thought that they were under some kind of waning or some kind of parasitic energy or anything like that. Blessed salt would be scattered at the thresholds of the houses and of windows to make sure that nothing could come in. It's different if something is already in. There are ways of removing it or asking it to go. They'd be very careful around. For example, there was a very old blessing on St. Martin's Eve, which was the 11th of November. St. Martin was considered one of the great protector saints. And so on the farmland on those days, they would often bless either with holy water, salt, or with blood, usually the blood of a bird. They would bless the four corners of the farm to make sure that nothing could come and nothing could take milk or take animals away. There is also, then we would use what we call sacramentals, which are blessed objects. So icons of the saints, blessed medals, particularly the Saint Benedict medal, was considered a very, very powerful protector. It carries within it an exorcism within its blessing, and so to wear it is effectively to carry an exorcism with one. And there are various other, sacramentals and prayers. In the Celtic monastic tradition, we had what were called the Chaim prayers, and the Chaim prayers were circle prayers that were prayed with the hand outstretched. The right hand was outstretched and a circle was traced around the person. Or they would take a walking stick or a staff and trace a circle in the ground around them while praying for the protection of the Trinity around the person. So they brought their sacred space with them wherever they went as such. Chanting and singing, the ringing of bells, especially, were considered to be very, very effective in terms of clearing things that you didn't want around. And one of the reasons iron was considered a great blessing from the Middle Ages on was because iron was seen as being 3 times consecrated. So it comes from the earth in its natural, that's its first blessing, the blessing of creation. Its fire is used within it. That's its second blessing, the blessing of fire, so one of the third elements. And the third blessing was that it was iron nails that were used at the crucifixion. And so it was said that the evil spirits, or the negative side of these things, had great fear of iron, because it was through iron that their kingdom fell. And so these were the 3 reasons that iron was traditionally used within our tradition. So yeah, there's lots of different practices that were used even to this day. I mean, right the way up to today, following my own grandmother's tradition, particularly with regard to the dead coming up to All Hallows Eve and Halloween, salt and bread and water would usually be left out at the hearth, because that's one of the evenings. Halloween and Christmas Eve were the 2 evenings where it was expected that the ancestors would visit. And so to show reverence and respect for them, food, salt and water would be left out. It couldn't be eaten by anybody afterwards. It had to be scattered over the house and over the ground then, as a way of bringing blessing then afterwards. So there's lots of these practices that are very, very ancient and that go way back. And I think a lot of people would be somewhat taken aback nowadays to hear that these are actually part of the Catholic tradition from the beginning. Yeah. I know many Christians who when they hear this kind of go, oh, but that's all pagan, isn't it? I thought that was pagan. And you're saying, well, actually, no, number one, and number two, a lot of the practices, you need to know the why of them as well, because we might use things in the same way. I know plenty of people who are not of my faith who use salt or use iron or use whatever, and they may have different reasons for it. But the important thing is knowing the why within the particular tradition, because the why, the intentionality, is what gives these things its particular power, as opposed to what we would call sacraments, as opposed to sacramentals. Sacraments in our tradition have intrinsic power. In other words, it doesn't matter what the intention is. Once they exist, they exist.
Yeah, you're right. It's so interesting to hear, all these examples, the drawing of the circle, the chanting, as you say, the water, and the the various prayers and things. These are all aspects of protection that we use in a huge array of sort of pagan approaches and systems. So yeah, it's it kind of just really highlights that it works. You're going to be calling on.
It's a toolbox, and I think one of the things to be aware of is that, okay, obviously you stand where you stand and you have your particular tradition, etc. But I think it's really important for all of the traditions to understand that a lot of this comes out of a basic human understanding of how these things work. And sometimes I think we can be very we can draw boundaries that don't need to be there, in terms of actually saying, oh, well, I'm this and you're that, so therefore there could not possibly be anything in common between us. When in actual fact, the primary thing to say is, well, you're a human being and I'm a human being. So let's start from there and then see what works and what's present within it. So, like, to give you an example, some years ago I was asked to do a wedding, and the wedding was the bride was Catholic and the groom was neo-pagan. And he had said that she was a devout Catholic, so she was only going to get married in a Catholic church. She wanted her Catholic marriage. So they came along to meet me. I'd never met them before in my life, but they came along to meet me because he had said that he could go with the marriage as long as it was a Franciscan who was doing the marriage, because he felt we were somewhat connected to the earth. Mm. So he said, okay, no problem. So I met the two of them anyway. And he said, look, it's really important to me that there are elements from my tradition present in the wedding. And she kind of threw her eyes to heaven. And I said, no, it's fine. I said, what are you looking for? And he said, well, what he was really looking for was the invocation of the four elements as part of the start. But I said, I have no problem with that. But I said, just so you're aware, we do that. He said, what do you mean? I said, we do that already. I said, we invoke earth in terms of the blessing of the consecrated stone that is the altar. I said, the land itself is marked out, anointed, blessed, and consecrated underneath the church. So I said, we invoke the earth and we speak of her as our sister, Mother Earth. That's within our Franciscan tradition. I said, the fire end of things, like, why do you think we have candles in church? We have candles because we honor Brother Fire. And, there's a candle ceremony at the very heart of the marriage where we take two flames that you light and we unite those together to show the mingling of, your spirit, your soul in this wedding. I said, air, we bless you with incense and we surround you with incense. And I said, water is fine. We have a purification ritual with holy water at the start of every liturgy. So I said, the four elements are present within the liturgy. So he said, oh, I never saw it that way before. He said, yeah. So he was fine with that. And when it came to the wedding, the funny bit of this was when it came to the wedding, we did all of the pieces and all of the bits, and he was fine and she was fine. And it came to the water ceremony, the holy water, and I went to him and he bowed beautifully to receive water and receive the blessing. And when I went to my good Catholic bride, I went to sprinkle her with water and she said, don't sprinkle me. The dress is silk. Don't sprinkle me. So it was one of these lovely moments of kind of mutual understanding, because both sides were open to actually recognizing that, these things are very often woven into in such a way that if we don't know the why of what's going on, we don't necessarily know, that we can find a place in each other's tradition, in each other's story, much more easily than we think.
No, I absolutely agree. I think it's more important than ever to recognize that there is no division between us all. We are all human beings, and we all, want the same things, really, is that we live our lives, for love of each other, of life, and whatever it is that really kind of moves us and brings us meaning from day to day. Sure. So no, you're absolutely right.
I always say to people, look, the most important thing is you're searching for truth and you're living love, right? They're the two things. And as long as you're searching for truth and living love, I have no argument with you. Why would I? I believe God to be truth and love. So you're on your path to that. And for myself, my path is, I believe as a Christian, as a Catholic, I believe that Jesus Christ is the revelation of divine wisdom and truth, and also the revelation of divine love. But that means that if I'm really going to follow Jesus Christ, I honor truth and love wherever I find it. And I find it in the heart of every human being. So my job is to be a reverend, not a reverend, but to be reverent before every other human being.
Mm. Yeah. I'm so with you, and so again, it kind of makes me think about the start of all of this in terms of the order that you follow and what their ideas were. And you mentioned at the beginning that there were some that believed that there was just kind of angels and demons, and of course we see this through history.
Yeah.
And there were some that believed that no, there are these other beings in between. And so
Hmm.
how did that kind of play out with the with the order in the beginning, the people that, from on a day-to-day basis, and was that documented early on?
Yeah, it was. There were different schools of thought that looked at things in
Yeah.
different ways. In fact, if your listeners are, or your watchers are looking for a really good modern kind of description of all of that, then there's an author called Paul Thigpen, Thigpen, and he has written a beautiful book specifically on the Christian Church's view of non-human intelligence, particularly extraterrestrial life, over the centuries.
Oh,
And he goes through the full range of the opinions, the authorities, the teachers, those people who said, no, there couldn't possibly be, and those who said, of course there is, and everything in between.
yeah.
And the one thing you'll find is that the church has never made a declarative, dogmatic statement about the existence of the Middle Kingdom, ever. It has simply said, we weren't told, we don't know, so all we can do is listen to the experience of those who have experienced it. And take the advice of St. Paul, which was test the spirits at all times. In other words, you look for the fruits of the encounter. And if something is bringing anxiety, fear, darkness, depression, kind of a parasitic eating out of somebody or whatever, then obviously that's negative and we need to treat it as such. But if something is encouraging, beauty, wisdom, truth, love, community, even ecological communion, then we treat that with respect and reverence and recognize it as something that is bearing good fruit. The tree is known by its fruit. So that's what you live with along the way. So within the Franciscan tradition, we're only one monastic order of many monastic orders within the Catholic faith. We would speak of, as I mentioned, cosmic fraternity. And this was the great vision of St. Francis, that if we accept a creator God, if we accept, an all-loving Father, then that means that everything that exists is one family. And that means that my job, and this is why we're called brother or sister in the female half of the order, that's not a title, it's a job description. It's to say, like, my job is to become brother to every being I encounter, regardless of at what point in the ladder it's at. So St. Francis talked about having reverence and respect for the earth itself, for the rocks, for the sand, for the trees, for the water, for the fire, etc., and referred to them all as brother or sister. And this is the way that to this day I don't say we succeed, we try. This is the way that we try to live, is to live in this understanding that we are all brothers and sisters, and that every being that I encounter, I'm supposed to encounter with reverence and respect. And I think that leaves us very open then to encounter, because when that's the attitude, the intention you're living with, the other side of things knows that, and I think tends to manifest then more easily, because it knows it's not going to get a kind of a fear response or an anger response.
So it's acceptance is the key.
Yeah, I think so. And this goes back to the very essence of monastic meditation, contemplation, which isn't unique to Christianity. But it's present within all the various monastic traditions, which is simply what nowadays 21st century speak would call mindfulness, but really it's acceptance of reality as it is in the now, in the present moment. And when we sit in that way, when our mind and our heart are trained not to scuttle off to the future or back into the past all of the time, but to really take in the present through the senses, there is an opening or an awakening that takes place over time, but it takes place that allows, I think, the senses to become a little bit sharper and a little bit more aware, and we tend to encounter a little more, especially nowadays when people are pretty much so distracted all of the time. A lot of the things I've encountered or seen along the way, I've been with other people in busy places when that's happened, but unless you point it out to them, very often people are very distracted and don't notice in the moment.
Well, actually, this is something that you write about in your book, and Calming the Storms, your latest book, I should say. It's something I wanted to ask you about, actually, which is a beautiful book, really very useful resource. And I hope, nearer the end of the conversation, you're able to read a poem from your book.
Sure.
I wondered about, if you could talk a little bit about the difference between mindfulness and Christian mindfulness. What is the difference? Oh, you just slightly touched on
Sure.
it there.
If you're human, you can be mindful. Okay. All that mindfulness is a quality of human awareness, which is basically saying open-hearted awareness, a kind of a general curiosity with regard to the present moment, and choosing to be present. So all of the religious traditions, all of them, all of the mystical traditions, all of them essentially teach this as like step one in any kind of meditative discipline. It's about, not letting go of our thoughts, because as human beings, it's actually very hard to let go of the thoughts, but it's to be aware of the thoughts while not being, chomping at them, not being in at them the whole time. So we begin to see thoughts, emotions, sensations, etc., as simply the weather that's constantly changing, constantly moving, constantly arising, constantly going away. And once I begin to be aware of that, I become aware then of an I, as in the letter I, an I that exists beyond thoughts, emotions, feelings, sensations. And so with the awareness of that I comes a greater kind of equanimity, a being at peace that allows the other stuff to kind of flow along and flow over. And it's not distancing yourself from life. It's not switching life off. It's actually experiencing it at a deeper level, because we begin to lower the dial on anxiety and stress and begin to be more present to things. And then there's the possibility of deciding, this stuff that arises is useful, I'm going to hold on to it. This stuff that arises is not useful, I can let it go. Mm-hmm. So that's basic mindfulness. And any human being, secular, religious, mystical, whatever, any human being can do that. Where the traditions differ then is sort of in the next steps, because what you're asking is, well, what's your ultimate goal? Like, why are you beginning to undertake this? And some people will say, I just want to deal with stress, or I just want to deal with the distracted life. I want to be more focused. Or some people will say, I want to be more in tune with nature and the rhythms of the natural world, or whatever it might be. In the Buddhist tradition, one of the reasons for mindfulness is to arrive at, single pointed consciousness, as the Buddhist tradition calls it, or sati, awareness, full awaking, that would eventually bring one towards enlightenment, etc. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, we would say that awareness is so that we begin to focus on the presence of the divine that is already around us, already within us. St. Paul speaks of the presence of the divine as being the one in whom we live and move and have our being. When St. Catherine of Siena was asked to define the presence of God to the soul, she said, God is in the soul and the soul is in God, like the fish is in the water and the water is in the fish, But most of the time we are completely unaware of it, because we're so distracted. So we use the mindful techniques, the techniques of focusing, moving away from distraction, moving away from anxiety, to become more and more aware of divine presence in that sense. So the essential difference is that we move from a simple mental state of awareness to a relational state with the divine, where we are then inviting the divine to make whatever healing, change, growth is necessary, so that we can become more alike to the divine. Because the ultimate movement within the Christian mystical tradition is what we call theosis, which is to become as alike to the divine as it is possible to become while still being a human being. And that's a participation in divinity itself. So most people are kind of, we didn't really know that that's the goal of it all, but that's the ultimate goal. That all prayer, all service, all love, all human life, we believe, is pointing towards.
That's wonderful. It puts me in mind also of the Buddhist tradition, the Brahma Viharas, because they too, it's kind of comparative in some way, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
very interesting to me. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you for describing that and clarifying.
No problem.
Uh, when you are kind of going towards situations where you might be called to help, then, I mean, have you had any situations where I don't know whether people might have told you, oh, well, there's some kind of issue with otherworldly beings, or whether they might have given them another term. But have you had situations like that that people have asked you to aid with?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Many times. And the first thing I'd say is that 90% of what you're called out to turns out to be nothing at all. Um, Human beings are very good at scaring themselves. They don't need a whole lot of help from the other side. And so what you can often find is that, as one of my own teachers said to me, the number of times it's turned out to be mice, I could count on both hands. Because if you're quiet in a room by yourself at night and there's a mouse in the room, the mouse can sound like it's got hobnail boots on walking around the place. But anyway, so when we'd get called out, we go out listening. That's the most important thing. We listen to the story. We listen to what's really going on. Often, it's not just the person wants to tell you the story of the apparition, the moment, the thing. But what we really want to hear is, well, what led up to it? How is the family? How are you at the moment? What's going on for you at the moment? Because liminal states that allow these things to kind of be present or manifest are often, they can be traumatic responses, they can be exhaustion responses, etc. And that's not saying that the thing didn't happen. It's just saying that we're more keyed in to allowing those things to be present when we're like that. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of stories, I've dealt with, imaginary friends that turned out not to be imaginary. I've dealt with ghost manifestations, poltergeist manifestations. I would say of all the things I've been called to, only on one occasion did I come across something which was absolutely negative. I wouldn't go so far as to call it demonic because I don't know if that's what it was. It wasn't a possession or anything like that. But it was just a very negative, parasitic haunting that was really making people suffer. And I've also dealt with situations that may very well have been more kind of nature spirit of some description. And mostly those would be sorted by kind of pacification, by sort of talking and saying, look, mistakes have been made, problems have happened. They didn't mean to offend, and acting as a kind of an arbitrator in some way between that and sort of restoring the balance or the peace. Whereas the negative stuff, if it turns out to be really negative, sometimes you just have to march it off the property and kind of say, you're not welcome here, you're not coming back. So yeah, there've been all of those kind of elements along the way in my own life. I've encountered stuff as well, and it's been part of our family as well a long way back. My mother's line particularly would have had a lot of kind of awareness and strange encounters and all of that kind of stuff. And there were healers in the family line along the way back, what we would have called in Ireland sharp women, which meant people who had some kind of a touch or gift for healing and for what they call the coming in and the going out. So they would have helped with birth and death. My great grandmother particularly was renowned in Dublin as a sharp woman, and she would be called in for those bits and pieces along the way. Lots of little bits and pieces. And then when I was younger, I spent a lot of time in the forests, in the woods, etc. And if you're spending a lot of time in nature, I think you become aware of the presences that are there, even if it's not direct manifestation or whatever. But certainly, you begin after a while to recognize that it's a reciprocal relationship. You're not just looking at it; it's looking at you in some way as well. So, I mean, I suppose one manifestation I had when I was very young. I used to go up to the woods a lot, and would be there kind of late into the evenings, late into night sometimes, just watching foxes or badgers or that kind of stuff. And there was one occasion my brother was with me, and we were sitting waiting for the badgers to turn up, kind of midsummer, so still very bright in the woods, and we were watching one direction, and I saw a kind of a glint from the side, and I turned to see, and I saw what I can only describe as a fox, but a fox maybe 3 times bigger than a fox should be. It was absolutely beautiful, glowing, that red orange. And it was kind of curled up on a branch. There was an arched branch that kind of went up from the ground and back down again, and it was sitting on it. And it was looking at me, and I was looking at it. And I was totally frozen in the moment. Like, I had cameras with me for the badgers. I had my brother with me. I could easily have given him a nudge and said, look. But it was just that thing of being frozen in the encounter in the moment. And it stood up and yawned the way foxes do. And it kind of stretched itself the way foxes do. But all I can say is it was like the perfection of a fox. what a fox, if a fox was perfect, what it should be. But, much, much bigger than a fox is. I mean, I knew foxes well, and this was much bigger than any fox. And I turned to my brother to say, look, and when I turned back, there was just a sunbeam on the branch and it was gone.
Amazing.
And he said, what? And I said, oh, I thought I saw something. And I never said another word about it. But many years later, while studying and researching all of this stuff, we came across so in Irish and Gaelic, fox is shunnach. You'll sometimes see it translate called Madra Rua, which is red dog, but that's a very, kind of anglicized version. But shunnach is the old name for fox. And there was this idea of what they called the king fox. And the king fox was supposed to be seen very, very rarely and was a kind of a protector of the woods. So when they described it in the books, it was, a beautiful fox, much bigger than the other foxes, could disappear when it wanted to disappear, etc. So I don't know what I saw. I can't tell you I saw this or I saw that. I can only describe what I saw. And it was a beautiful feeling that went with it. There was a real feeling of like that it was right for us to be in the woods. It was like the woods were kind of welcoming us in that way. Never saw anything like it again, but it's one of those ones that's just written into my memory in a beautiful way. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. That's absolutely beautiful to hear. I love it. I love that. And I can really, I can really feel into that sense of, when you're coming eye to eye with it, there's that moment, isn't there?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Moment of knowing. How old were you then?
Oh, I would have been maybe 13, 14 sometime.
Oh, so then on the cusp of adulthood, we sort of I sent you a couple of things that I said I wanted to talk to you about, and one of them was this sense of the rites of passage and ritual being missing in today's modern Western society, anyway, for young men, for young people.
Yeah.
So there's something about having an encounter around their age that feels particularly powerful, and as you say, kind of having that blessing.
Yeah,
the forest and that acknowledgement.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that when you look at the anthropological kind of understanding of the rites of passage, the rites of initiation, is we would say there are 4 basic elements given to a young person if rites of initiation are done properly. So regardless of what tradition you're in, regardless of what faith path you walk or whatever, if they're being done right, you will see the same 4 things appear. The first is the recognition by the young person that they are they're a gift to the tribe or the community. So there is a teaching to the young person that you are necessary, you are unique, we are less without you, and that the cosmos, the universe, whatever you want to call it, sees you as necessary for being. And that gives an extraordinary groundedness to a young person as they go forward, because it means that, nobody can take value from you when your value is transcendent, when it's not dependent on what you do, and it's not dependent on how you look or, any of the human things. And obviously within the Christian tradition, we would establish that as the divine in that sense. The second thing that it does is it invites the young person to enter into mutuality, which is, well, if I'm unique, then everybody else is unique as well. And so if we want the full outpouring of what it is to be a human being, I have to look after them and they will look after me. So now we have the idea of the adolescent is moved from egoic selfishness, because all adolescents are egoically selfish. You're supposed to be an adolescence for a little bit, It's that thing of exploring who you are. As one of my teachers used to say, a 13-year-old believes the sun comes up in the morning because that's when they're awake. The whole universe is sorted on them. So there's a movement away from that. And we begin to recognize that actually the collective is extremely important. So I don't lose my individuality. That's the first point I've been given. Utterly unique, utterly essential. But the second part is mutuality of responsibility, which is essential to being an adult. And it's essential to the development of compassion. The third thing that's given is a cosmology of meaning. So I begin to receive the story, whatever the story is, because human beings organize reality narratively. Like our brain is made for story. In the Christian tradition, we would call this the logoic brain. That the brain is meant to receive the word, meant to receive the story, and each human being holds within themselves seeds of the word. But again, even outside of any specific tradition, the idea is I have a story of ultimate meaning, and that cosmology connects everything. So I grow then in reverence and respect for the earth, the food that I have, the things that I use, the people that I meet, the animals, all of the levels of being. And I'm introduced to being a member of that great story, that unfolding story. And the fourth piece, which is the most important, because this is the bit that kind of goes in and keys in the rites of initiation, is an experience of transcendence. The young person has a safe experience of transcendence. In other words, they encounter the divine, the numinous, the liminal. They encounter the spiritual world in a definitive way that says to them, this is real and I can rely on it. Mm. And if those four things are present, you get a human adult. If those four things aren't present, a human being will spend the rest of their life searching for those things. And very often, sadly, the thing that eventually bestows a kind of an unwilling initiation will be trauma of some kind instead. And so we get an initiated adult, but a broken one along the way, rather than the idea of the supported, unitive, community-centered, cosmologically sound person who's living meaning over purpose. And what I mean by that is that when you get up in the morning and I get up in the morning and every human being gets up in the morning, we have a list of things we have to do. That's our purpose. Okay. We go through the day, we do the jobs, we look after people, we look after each other, we feed ourselves, etc., etc. And we end up in our bed at the end of the day and you can tick off the list and say, yeah, I had a good day. I achieved things. Okay. But that's not a human life. A human life is a life where you go to bed at the end of the day and you say, I lived meaning. I lived meaningfully today. I have in some way corresponded with universal reality, with the divine, with whatever you want to call it as. And because of that relational experience, I am participating in meaning. In other words, my little story, I can see how that fits into the big cosmological story. And I can feel that story is unfolding in and through me. And if I have that, then actually the day job doesn't really matter as long as it allows me space to live the big story. Mm-hmm. But the Western world reversed that completely in about the 1700s with the so-called Enlightenment, when they said, actually what we want are workers. So we don't want any of these big stories. And if we're going to tell big stories, we'll tell them in such a way to pacify the worker. Mm. To this day, education, work, etc., tends to work still to produce a non-reflective worker who lives their whole life in desperate hunger for those things, but doesn't know how to get them. And the wonderful thing about all of this waking up that's going on, whether it's through your podcast or through people's encounters or through, people coming to meditation groups with us or people going to fairy census websites or whatever it might be, is that it's inviting people to go, oh, it's bigger. It's all much bigger than I thought. And that means I'm bigger than I thought. And it means I don't have to rely on others then to project an identity onto me. And we're back to, I'm just searching for love and truth.
So well said. And you're right. People are starting to realize what was kind of overlaid on us as on our humanity, and how that has kind of constricted us so that we're unable, we know we've been searching for something, and suddenly I think, around the kind of lockdown years, it's just been laid open that it's so clear. Once we stopped in that moment of peace, it's so clear, and is still becoming clearer every day to many, many more people, what the effect of, as you say, the so-called enlightenment had, and that we lost that sense of wonder and connection with all beings, as you said, that your order recognized right from the beginning that we are all part of this world, and so are, we connected with the earth, and that we're connected with these beings, so it's so clear to me, that I know that it's something that you're not taught about in school. And I mean, big changes need to come for sure.
And I think those changes come about when people, maybe even the people who had the traumatized initiation, but they become, parents or grandparents or teachers or uncles or aunts or whatever, and they begin to allow space for that hunger to manifest, or they give language to the young person to be able to enunciate their quest. Because if you don't give positive spaces, and if you don't have positive elders who, and I mean that in the technical sense, elders, not necessarily chronologically aged, but elders who are able to facilitate this even as in a conversational way, young people will seek this, but they will often seek it from each other. And one of the principles of initiation is you cannot be initiated into a level beyond the level you're at by people who are at the level you're at. You have to have gone into the next room to be able to describe it. And so what can happen then is negative or even dangerous kind of initiatory experiences that can often, disconnect the young person actually, or make them, kind of dwell more in ego rather than the mutuality that I was talking about.
Well, yeah, that is the danger. And I think as a global society, we're tapping into those dangers too. It's like we're kind of trying to initiate ourselves as a global community in some way, and how can we find our way back from that? But actually it's the trauma, interestingly, to observe that, this horrendous sense of, there's a sense of things feeling unbearable right now in the world. And, I think about that sometimes that is what it takes. Unbelievable to think that it could be like that. But for some people, that is what it takes for them to actually find their compassion, and for them to realize, the meaning in life for them, and to find the love within themselves. So it's a very rich time, and very appropriate time to be, speaking of these things, but especially, as I say, for young people. And I will link that the interview that you had, in particular with the two young men in the Garden of Earthly Delights, because I thought it was a really fantastic discussion, and I'm glad we got to talk about that here too, because it means a lot to me.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you mentioned the encounter that you had in the forest there, and I'm not sure whether you think that ticks the last box of the connection with the divine. I don't know whether you considered it to be something like
Well,
that.
I'd say it was certainly a connection with something transcendent.
Mm.
I would imagine that for me at the time it was a kind of a validation of the intuition that in some way, the forest, the woods weren't just individual trees and individual species and individual this and individual that, but that there were other consciousnesses present there as well. And it certainly felt like I'd looked in a particular direction and received a gaze back in return. A similar thing, though not as dramatic, maybe happened to me some years later when I was a friar, a monk at this stage, and I was in Assisi in Italy, where St. Francis was from, and I was spending a day meditating at the caves up in the mountain where St. Francis used to meditate himself. And it's a beautiful old Italian forest right up on the cliff edge, and I was sitting out in front of one of the caves, and I said to myself, what must it have been like in the Middle Ages to come up here, like with no electricity, nothing else, maybe just a little fire, and kind of, sitting here for days, weeks on end, in meditative retreat. And I said, I'm sure that, the others, whoever the others are abiding in this place, must have drawn closer. And as I kind of had that thought, I looked down at my feet, and there was a seashell right at my feet. Now, this is way up an Italian mountain, inland, middle of nowhere, and it was a beautiful, what they call a lucerne. So it looks like a half moon, a beautiful in half moon. And I picked it up because it was perfectly clean and clear. Like I could have missed it on the way into the cave. I don't believe that I did. So I sat with it for a while and held on to it, and I felt, this is lovely. It's a little recognition, a little moment from whatever else is here to say, yeah, we're here too. The beautiful time of meditation. And as I was leaving, I went to put it into my pocket to take with me, and I stopped for a second because I forgot one of the rules, and one of the rules is ask, is this okay for me to take away?
Yeah.
And I got a very clear response of, I'm just showing you one of my treasures. Don't take it away. It's mine. Now, I don't know who or what that was, but it was very clear. So I thanked them for sharing this lovely beauty with me. And I was going to take a photograph. And then I said, no, I'm not taking a photograph. I'm not taking anything of it away. Mm-hmm. And I put it down exactly where I found it, and thanked whoever had dropped it there, whoever had left it there, and walked off. And I think one of the things, and I was very glad that I hadn't walked off with something belonging to something else. And I think that's one of the things that the rules sometimes people forget, the rules that are in folklore, the rules that are present, which is sometimes nowadays, because we're coming at it so hungry, or we're coming at it so energized by any manifestation, that we forget to simply ask. We're in somebody else's house. You don't go into somebody else's house and pick up their ornament and say, well, I'm off with this now. I like this. This is beautiful. Thank you. You sit down and you say, that's beautiful. But, number one, is it for me? And there's a lovely old piece of wisdom, monastic wisdom. And I'd really, I'd share this with your followers, especially, which is, if you do receive something, don't hold on to it forever. Don't invest in it an attachment. Hold on to it and revel in its beauty and in the gift that it was. And then either leave it somewhere wild for somebody else to pick up, or actually pass it on as a gift to somebody else. And then you won't be held in an attachment by it. Because I do know people who over the years have collected, huge collections of stuff, bits and pieces. And they're only as good as the memory or the story that go with them. After that, what are they? So it can often be good to say, yeah, they were with me for a while, but I'm not going to cling to these things. I'll keep letting them go, let them go back into the natural world, let them go back to, or give them to somebody else, or whatever along the way, because something has shared beauty with you. So why not share beauty further, rather than desperately clinging to it as your proof text of something that happened, you know?
That's a very wise advice. And I guess maybe people could pass them on as offerings in another sacred location, maybe,
Sure.
or
Absolutely. There's a lovely story of a Buddhist nun who was sitting doing meditation up, I think, one of the mountains in somewhere in India, and she had a huge pile of stones beside her. And her meditation that her teacher had given her was to pick up the stone, to look at it, and to really examine it, and then put the stone down, and to pick up the stone, and so on and so on. And eventually she was taking a break, and one of the people who had come to see her said, "Sister, what will you do when all the stones from that side are over there?" And she said, "Then I will begin by picking up a stone from here and putting it over there." In other words, the work is always continuing. You know, we don't arrive at a point of clinging and holding to the treasure. The treasure is only valuable if you can pass it on and make it do other things. After that, it's just being a miser and sitting on the gold, you know.
It's very true. And maybe that kind of ties into, you know, things that we create as well. Because it can very easily, you know, you get an urge to create something, don't you? And then you know I'd say you're filled with the divine, really, in order to create something.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then because of that feeling, you might think, oh, well, this is the thing. And then just kind of really wanting to hold that. And actually, you're already feeling that the energy of it wants to go somewhere else, but that's the scary bit. You kind of want to hold on to it. So I guess that's a really important lesson. Thank you for
Welcome.
sharing that. Yeah.
It's a hard one as well for all of us, but yeah.
It's the hardest thing, isn't it, to
Yeah.
let go? It really
Sure.
is. It really is. Uh, Especially when something's so precious to us. But is this something then that you advise when people come to you? I think you mentioned just before that you'd been called to help with situations that might be related maybe to nature spirits. How do you advise them in relating to these beings?
Um, the first level is listening, and by that I mean, okay, the person tells the story, and sometimes, you know, maybe they were frightened or shocked or whatever, and then it's to try and place that in the context of you're okay. This is part of a much wider human understanding. You know, it's part of our history, part of our tradition, part of our talk. It's just that people don't talk about it maybe as much anymore. And so that can sort of take a lot of the tension out of the person. And usually you find, you know, that someone who's kind of involved with these things often has either the family or themselves have a kind of a history of, you know, that sort of experience or personality as well. You know, often there's a lot of stuff going on for them. I can give you an example if you like. It's a story I've told before, but give you an example. So there was a gentleman got in touch with us some years ago. This is about 20 years ago now. And he was part of what we would call in Ireland the ascendancy, the Irish ascendancy. So they were the sort of, they were native Irish, but they would have had very high up semi nobility kind of thing, high up roles in Irish society in the sort of the 1700s, 1800s, that kind of thing. Anyway, that was the family he belonged to, very famous family. His grandfather had been a member of the colonial service when Ireland was part of the British Empire and all of that, and had travelled to, now I always make a mistake, it's either Nigeria or Kenya, I can't remember which, but anyway, one of those places. And he had been a DC, a district commissioner in one of these places. Anyway, he was very much of his time, and you know, the way he treated the locals, left a lot to be desired. And he ran into a situation where he had an ongoing feud with one of the particular tribal area where he was, one of the medicine men. I don't know the correct indigenous term for that particular place, but if I say that, we know what we're talking about. And so, as part of his sort of effort to try and let them see who was in charge, he broke into a sacred enclosure they had within the village, and he took, I shouldn't say stole, he took two statues that were of two local deities, protector deities, which nobody was supposed to even be able to look at. It was a very sacred end of things. So obviously a huge sacrilege for the people there, a huge sin against their tradition, etc. And the following night he woke up, and there was dancing and drumming and all kinds of things going on right outside his house. And the following day, the people who were working for him, said, you have to give those back. A curse has been put on you. These things need to go back, etc. Anyway, he poo-pooed the whole thing. Shortly afterwards, retired, left for home, and took these two statues with him. And from the time he took them back, there was an awful lot of ill health in the family, sickness, and it particularly affected whenever a child would be born. So he had a number of children. When they would have their first child, there was always, the child never died, but there was severe complications with every child who was born. So grandfather died anyway. Dad still had them at this stage in the house, and the grandfather had basically said they were never to leave the house, they were never to go, etc. And he would tell the story to people before he died anyway. So we now come to the gentleman who sought my help. So he came to say he was the eldest son. He'd inherited the house, inherited the statues, etc. But he was just about to have his first child, and he was terrified as to what could happen. Had said it to his brothers and sisters. They all said, look, this is all coincidence. This is all rubbish. So he came to me to say, would I basically destroy the statues, or would I get rid of them, or would I? And I said, absolutely not. These have to go back. Mm-hmm. This is the problem. So I said, can you bring them to me at least, and we'll see what happens. So the monastery I was in at the time was on a main street of a village. So he didn't know where we were. I'd only spoken to him by phone. So I was standing out on the curb to sort of wave at him whenever he would arrive to say, well, you're in here. I knew he was on the way. And while I was standing there, the street was very quiet, which was unusual. But while I was standing there, I was looking down the road this direction, and suddenly from beside me, I heard, excuse me. And I turned around, and there were two small African children standing beside me. Now, that wasn't unusual. It's quite a mixed ethnic area. So, but I actually jumped because they'd kind of come out of nowhere. And I said, yeah, are you okay? And they said, we're looking for somewhere to sing. And I said, sorry? They said, we're looking for somewhere to sing. And I said, well, there's the school up the road, there's the library, there's the church, there's a theater place up there. I went through a few different things, and they just kept looking at me. And they said, no, we're looking for somewhere to sing. And I said, okay, well, just hang on there a moment, because at that moment he came in with his car, came into the car park, and I turned around and the two kids were gone. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay, we're dealing with the real stuff here now. This isn't just family legend or whatever. So I didn't tell him about any of that. Went in, we brought in the two statues, and the lady who was the contact between us, she was also there as well. So we began a ritual, which is to basically pray for any ancestors, any spirits that are trapped, anything that's in need, that's in pain, etc. And when we did that, two very strong African presences came into the room. I could see them interiorly. He could feel that they were there. And the lady who had connected the two of us, she just burst into tears and spent the rest of the time crying. She just felt this overwhelming sorrow and sadness. And they were confused, these two presences. And they kept saying, we're lost. Where are we? We're lost. So I said to the gentleman who was there, they're here. And he said, I know, I can feel them. I said, okay. And he said, what do I do? He was terrified. And I said, you don't have to do anything except promise them that you will send them home. And I said, but remember, if you make this promise, you have to fulfill this promise. There's no getting away from this promise at all. So he said he would. And I spoke to them and said, look, this is not the person who took you from your home. This is somebody else. The family wants peace between you. And can you give us a promise that if they send you home, everything will finish with the family? And there was one presence that seemed older than the other, and it kind of nodded and said, yeah. So we blessed them then, and we prayed for the ancestors of all of the tribes, and we prayed for his grandfather, and we prayed for all of those people there, and for release and for peace for them all, and they faded out. And we were left with this extraordinary feeling in the room of just drained, very peaceful, but very drained. The poor lady was still crying because she was just so overcome with this. She said she could feel the sadness of like generations of people that were there. So we did the most important ritual act of all, which is to make a cup of tea immediately, straight afterwards, and try and pull ourselves together again, which we did. And I again reiterated to him, like, these have to go back. And he had started already but I don't really know where they came from. And I said, the country, like, start with that. So he called me a couple of days later to say that he'd gone to the embassy. And he went into them, and he was terrified they were going to get into trouble for stealing cultural artifacts. So he told the poor guy behind the counter this big long story, and the guy was like, what is he talking about? So he said, hold on, I'll go and get somebody. So he went off and got somebody. And when the guy came to the desk, the second guy came to the desk, he was from the tribe land where these statues belonged. And he said, oh yeah, these have to come home. There's no problem with that at all. So he thanked him. And he said, am I in trouble? And he said, no, if your grandfather, your great grandfather was here, he'd be in trouble. But no, you're not in trouble. Thank you for passing it back. And he took them back. And a couple of weeks later, the little boy was born and everything was fine. No problem. First time in ages, there'd been no issues or problems along the way. So for me, they were very much ancestor land spirits were connected with that hugely, because they appeared both as old and as young. And there was we were looking for a place to sing. We're lost and we need to go home. We sent them home.
It's an incredible story. I absolutely love that. Thank you. I think it really shows also that, a lot of the time when people are coming up against situations that are, troublesome, finding troublesome in some way, that, and I spoke to somebody actually on the last episode that was released, and it was a similar sort of thing. She'd arrived in a holiday home and immediately was aware of a presence, and it caused a lot of trouble. It caused the whole family to have bad dreams. And then because she had the sight, she caught sight of this being, and eventually it was able to communicate to her that it was trapped there. And she found a way to release it, through probably a similar thing to what you did. And, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many times people get into sticky situations and it is something that is trapped or stuck or misunderstood, or there's something around it that needs to be released. Yeah, looking for help. Absolutely. Do you find that that's the case in most of these situations, that these beings are looking for help?
Yeah, and it doesn't help that the modern paranormal kind of media end of things is very much of the everything is demons, everything is evil, everything is wrong, everything. Instead of arriving at a very, very, like, the level of inquiry that's demanded of us before we do anything is extremely high. Yeah. Because I have to arrive always with three most important words present in my head, which is, I don't know. Yeah. If I'm being brought in, I don't know. I don't know if this is psychological, if it's traumatic, if it's, hallucinatory or anything else, or if it's a real manifestation. And then if it is a real manifestation, you have to work through, where is it coming from? What is it? Why is it? All of those sort of things. So it takes time, and it's not suddenly arriving and, shouting and waving and roaring and, commanding. There is a place for that stuff as well, but that's so far down the road, and only if one has discerned clearly that, it's a bit of a battlefront situation rather than a negotiation or a gentle moving on or explaining. Like, I remember some years ago, I was a hospital chaplain for a while, and we had a gentleman who went through accidental death, very, very sudden accidental death, was worked on in the hospital, but sadly didn't make it. Yeah. And we were in the morgue afterwards, and I was praying over the body. The person was Catholic, and so I was doing the rites for the dying, for the dead, I should say. And as I was doing it, there was a chest of drawers of equipment, surgical equipment beside, and the whole surgical equipment started shaking. All of the drawers started shaking. And I just went on with the prayers. I've seen this stuff before, but there was an older lady, nurse, who was fixing things up, and a real country woman, older lady, very grounded, salt of the earth kind of. And she just leaned in past me and in a very funny way gave the corpse a kind of a slap on its backside and said, "Lie down, you're dead." And the whole thing just stopped. And she looked at me and she said, sometimes they have to be told, and walked off. And I think there's a huge amount of, the people who were close to birth and death, the people who were close to healing, the people who were in it, particularly in the less maybe medicalized end of things, had a tremendous wisdom about this, because they stood there, they saw these things. One of my first experiences of seeing anything was as a hospital chaplain when, as a deacon when I was training, and I was called out to a house to arrange a funeral. A man's son had died. So I went out to the house, had never met them before, knocked on the door. Gentleman invited me in, offered my condolences as you would. We made the cup of tea, we sat at the table, and in the room where we were sitting, there was a young man sitting as well. And I presumed this was the other son, and so I kind of nodded at him, and he smiled and nodded at me. And it was all very quiet, as you'd expect. And we sat at the kitchen table and we went through, the funeral and what they wanted, etc. And then he said to me, "Would you like to see him? Would you like to see John?" Was the boy's name who had died. And I said, "Of course, sure." And he went to get a photograph, and he came back and he showed me the photograph. And the photograph was the other boy who was sitting in the room. And I looked over, and the other boy just smiled at me and just faded, just disappeared.
Oh, goodness me.
And I just presumed it was the brother. And it was one of the first times something like that had happened to me, and within the work as such. So I kind of, was a little bit, I think, kind of peremptory, I'd say, in terms of sort of going out. And I went back to the church where I was, and the older priest was there, and I kind of babbled my story, and he was like, "Oh yeah, happens all the time." And I said, "Should I tell him?" And he said, "Did he ask you to tell him?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Then don't tell him." That was it. That was the advice,
I guess, you get a feel for these things, don't you? And if somebody might want to know.
You do as you go along. And I think whatever about that particular moment, I think it was the gentleman himself was the man whose son died was a great man of faith himself. So I think he was probably, very aware that, we go on and we're connected. So that was it. But I think sometimes the manifestations can be more for whoever sees them rather than to be communicated necessarily to others. So yeah, I think just to take a gentle approach, to take a listening approach, to get the full story, which may not be the first time you hear the story. And then to recognize that, we walk very gently in then. And so we would usually begin with simple prayers and blessings of the place itself. And that's also kind of tentative to sort of see, well, if it's something actually negative, it will respond negatively to the blessings. If it responds negatively to the blessings, then you kind of go up a level. And the next level are particular prayers of protection and blessing. And if it decides it's not going after that, then there is a ritual of, people have exorcism as the word, but there are rituals of kind of expulsion and cleansing, etc. And then it would only be after all of that if it was still causing problems, then the kind of heavy artillery are pulled out. And if that happens, there is no question, it goes. So because at that stage you're dealing with something that is entirely negative, and you kind of need to bring in the authority of the great and the good at that point to sort of shift things on. So we would invoke the saints, the angels, our Blessed Lady, and Christ himself at that point. And they move on. But if you're dealing with the kind of lower end of things, or the more nuanced end of things, the more earthly or nature or whatever, usually just the little blessings kind of set everything right again and kind of make peace between the two kingdoms again for a while.
Yeah, have you had to do that for anything that seems remotely fairy related then?
Yeah, a couple of times. So I suppose an experience I had personally was I was at my sister got married over in Portugal, and it was lovely. We were all invited over, lovely foreign wedding in the sunshine. I was doing the wedding. And we were staying in a hotel that was quite near a beach, but you had to walk through a kind of a little swampy wood to get to the beach. So one of these sort of like duney, foresty kind of places. So anyway, it's the nature of our life that we get up very early. So you usually find when you're on holidays with other people who don't live this kind of life that you spend the first couple of hours of the day just wandering around waiting for people to get up. Anyway, I was up very early, so I decided I'd go for a walk on the beach. I had done my meditation, done my prayer, etc., and I said I'd head out. There was a clearly marked path, and I was heading through the little foresty place on the way out. And I was standing in the forest just admiring it, and it was a copse, it wasn't a big forest, it was a little copse just on the way through. But as I'm sure you know, and as your listeners and watchers know, it doesn't have to be a big forest. It can be a tree or a bush anywhere. And out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a little movement at the base of a tree. And I went very slowly because I said, oh, squirrel or rabbit or something, and I wanted to see what it was. So I turned my head very slowly and I saw what I thought was a rabbit. That hunched over little curve that the rabbit has when it kind of pulls itself in. And then it stood up. It stood up on two legs. And all I can describe it as is it had the bottom half of a rabbit, but the top half of an old man. And was about the size of a rabbit. It was, if a rabbit stood up, I don't know. Anyway, Peter Rabbit sort of thing. So I looked at it and it looked at me, and there was a real feeling of, this is my wood. And I greeted it and thanked it for showing itself to me. And then it just changed. It just became very friendly. And I got the distinct feeling it wanted me to look away for a moment. So I looked away, and when I looked back,
Ah, yeah.
So that was the moment, and I just
Mm.
thanked it for revealing itself, because it may very well still have been there. But it was a little moment I felt of kind of peacemaking, of just sort of saying, yeah, we can acknowledge each other. We're all servants of the divine in the end. We're all part of that. And it it was one of the older brothers had encouraged me, whenever in a wild place like that, was to bless every being present, seen and unseen, even the beings I pass by, around, or through without knowing. And I've kept that blessing as a prayer, as a blessing along the way. And usually, if I start a journey or if I'm on the way, I'll pray that as a blessing. And the encouragement that I had that I'd done the right thing was about 2 years later. I was driving down the motorway in Ireland very early in the morning, and came to a particular corner where there were usually rabbits at the side of the road. And I would always slow a little bit in case one of them had run out. And there were two rabbits at the side of the road. And I said, oh, lovely rabbits. And was about to go around the corner, and one of them stood up.
Ah,
And it was the same little dude again, or something extremely alike.
yeah.
And we both kind of nodded at each other, and I drove on. And that was it.
Love
And
that.
there are very, very few people I have told that story to. But it's yeah, the rabbit people are out there somewhere.
Oh, I love that. That's so beautiful.
Mm.
I really thank you very much for sharing such a beautiful and personal
No problem.
story. The part where you say that there is a sense that you should look away, this is really interesting to me. I feel something like that happened with my kind of eye to eye little green man experience too. There was a point where I either blinked or looked away, and then he was gone. And that sense of this is what you need to do. That there's something about hearing you say that really kind of that kind of rings true with me. So that's very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and
That
it's
that's
it's very, very old lore that what you keep your gaze on can't move. Um, it goes right the way back. I mean, you'll even find it in the kind of the fairy stories, around the leprechaun with the gold, or the dragon that appears, or the unicorn, or whatever it might be. But the moment you take your eyes off, they can leave. And I think for me, there's two teachings within that. The first is to really learn contemplative gazing, to really learn, the ability to slow down and be present enough that you really do take in what's going on around you. And the second thing is that there's a courtesy as well in not staring. And particularly a human stare tends to be quite a predatory thing. And so even in conversation, we break eye contact all of the time. Now, we check in with each other, but we break eye contact as well. And so I think it's a very old principle that when, you meet a stranger, you meet somebody new or whatever, as, how many of us had a granny who told us it's rude to stare, and I think it's important for us to kind of recognize that there will be times when they have to go, and they give us that little push or that little distraction somewhere else to kind of take our attention away and back again.
Yeah. I guess, the way I think of it a lot of the time is this kind of a meeting of worlds in that moment when you lock eyes, because the eye gaze crops up a lot with people's experiences, people that I speak to. It's a very regular thing that happens. And I'm sure you experience this too in your line of aiding people. But yeah, it's kind of that meeting of worlds where for that moment you enter each other's worlds.
Yeah.
And that's where the connection is held in each other's presence, is through this gaze. It's very powerful. But it's really, yeah, really interesting to hear that. And I'm not going to keep you too much longer. Oh my goodness me. It's nearly
Don't
been
worry.
2 hours.
That's
Wow.
okay.
Oh my goodness. I had no idea we'd been chatting that long. Um, I don't know if you have time to talk about this, and you can say if you need to go, but one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because it's something I've been looking at I've been looking at quite a bit recently, are these experiences with Gwyneth Neath, aspects of the dark man, who, as you all know, is very prevalent in the Irish folklore as well. And I'm sure you're familiar with Dara Mason's work and the book that he released recently. Um, so yeah, I'm really interested in your take on this because, when I've spoken to my guests, sometimes the first experience that they have with an aspect of this being is one of shock. And I know they can appear in different forms too. And for some people, it's left there. They might not want to go any further, although actually the people I've spoken to have pushed through it and experienced some kind of there's a treasure to be found in the darkness, and that they're able to actually move usually through their own fear about something, and they kind of grow stronger as a person. So there's there's that aspect of things. And then if people have never had any kind of interaction with any beings before, and like you and I were brought up in a Catholic religion or Christian religion, and they're told about, dark forces and, for instance, the devil, then sometimes for people, there's an equation between the dark man, or, people like Gwyneth Neath, king of the fairies, these beings of the underworld, particularly the kind of kings of the underworld. So how do you make sense of that? And how do you view these figures?
Okay, it's a really good question. So there's maybe three things we can talk about on it. The first is it has always been a principle, and it's often forgotten, of this kind of lore, that lesser spirits will choose the name of bigger spirits to announce themselves, seeking more authority. So this is one of the big things about testing. It's a little bit like how when we talk about, say, something like past life regression, how everybody seems to be, a famous historical figure, and very few people are, well, nothing much happened in my life, because what's really happening is we're connecting with archetypes.
Yeah.
And when we connect with archetypes, we're in a mode of co-creation. So we talk about what we call the use of the imagination by the other to clothe itself. And again, I'm just stressing for your listeners that this is just my tradition talking. Obviously, I'm speaking out of my tradition with it. I'm not trying to be, not trying to change anybody else's experience, but just the wisdom of our tradition as such. And so we speak of one particular form of visioning or receiving, especially if it comes through dreams or dreamlike states, is what we call visio intellectus, which is where there is a real discarnate spirit or entity or whatever you want to call it, but it is able to use what's in your imagination to clothe itself so as to make itself apparent. And it can also use elements of your psychology as well. So if you tend to be very fearful or stressful or whatever, it can very often appear as something that's nearly a manifestation of your fear or your stress or whatever. So that's the first thing to talk about, is that they will often clothe themselves in names and in authority that they actually don't have. So that'll be the first thing. So I'm not saying somebody isn't meeting who they think they're meeting. What I'm saying is test them to find out if you are meeting who you think you're meeting. So that's really important. And that's part of the laws of courtesy as well. So that's the first thing. Second thing is the co-creation element, as I mentioned, to be very aware of that how I view this world internally can very often be how it will present itself to me. And so there is a challenge needed for the person to kind of be aware of that, and to really insist that whatever it is showing itself in its true form, in its sure form. Now, in our tradition, the way we achieve that is by not using our own authority, but by invoking the authority of a saint or, a good figure, Our Lady, and particularly Christ. But obviously, people in their own traditions will have other ways of doing this. When that happens, it's amazing how often we discover that the thing itself isn't what it's claiming to be at all. And it's not necessarily being evil. It's clothing itself. And so when we actually say, I want to see you as you are, sometimes we're actually not able to see it as it is. We don't have the capacity. This is particularly true, for example, with the angels. The angels manifest by clothing themselves, either in a corporeal nature or in vision or in image, but they're not, we don't see them as they are because we're unable to see them as they are. We're not on that level. And when they do try and show us that, it's often terrifying to people because it's so far beyond what they experience. There's a wonderful passage in one of C.S. Lewis's fictional books, the Perelandra, which is one of the science fiction books, where he's on another planet, and the Adam and Eve of that planet are getting ready to meet the angels, and the angels are having a conversation amongst themselves as to how will they cope with seeing us. So they eventually clothe themselves in a kind of a human way, but what they show beforehand is so utterly terrifying that nobody can kind of see it. Anyway, an aside. The third thing I would say is, like, if it is who it says it is, you really need to know your lore. And you don't accept what it says about itself, because that's not a good human thing anyway. We don't accept what people say about themselves. We listen, and then we let them prove what they say about themselves. Just because, and I think sometimes there can be this wonder and awe that, oh my goodness, this presence is speaking to me. This particular thing is turning up. So I'm in such awe at that. I listen to everything it's saying, and I do everything it's saying without ever asking, is this a good thing? Is this real? So, like, test it. Just test it. The final thing I'd say is about darkness. So darkness is not a synonym for evil.
Yeah.
Evil is either the absence of good or the overthrowing of the good.
Yeah. Warping.
Darkness has various experiences in spirituality. And even when we come to the understanding of the divinity itself, we would say that it is a light so bright, we perceive it as darkness. Because if you're dazzled, if you walk into a dark room and suddenly somebody switches on all the lights at once, you don't see immediately. You're dazzled back into darkness, and it takes time for the sight to recover. And the same is true for the inner sight as well. So simply to refer to oneself as dark doesn't necessarily mean evil. But I think what we have to be, like, even in our tradition, we speak of the holy dark. The holy darkness of recognizing that there are times when intellect, imagination, memory, will, all of these must become silent and quiet and are nearly turned off, so as to simply just be in divine presence. But yeah, I think one of our biggest problems is people don't read fairy stories enough. And so they don't know the knowledge that's encoded in all of these things. Because if one of these figures, like the ones you've mentioned, turns up, you're in for it. Like, you're in for a big story. And you need to be aware of that, and you need to make sure that you're protected in the midst of that. Because one of the other things we forget sometimes is that spiritual agencies and entities, they don't believe in health and safety. They are there to achieve an experience. And if you say yes to them, then the experience will happen. But there's no guarantee of how you come through that. So to be as careful as possible, walk gently, walk with reverence, walk with respect. If something turns up and tells you it's this, say, maybe. Let's see the why and the how. And to make sure that anything that's drawing you in a direction, the first question is always, is the direction making me more loving, more truthful, more compassionate, more open, or is it draining me? And if there's a draining, it's not a good thing, and it may not be who it says it is.
I think that's very sound advice. And when you talk about testing, in what ways might you test in a practical way?
Well, a lot depends on your tradition. But for example, in our tradition, if something turns up and starts giving, names and information, etc., one of the first things to do would be just forget about names, forget about anything that's giving you information, forget about any promises that are being made or whatever along the way. Mm-hmm. But to see, can it abide in a place of light and kindness and peace? Mm-hmm. And if it can't abide in a place like that, if it's trying to draw you away from that, if it's trying to isolate you particularly, and this is one of the things that very often happens with people in family, they will find they're being drawn further and further away. They're being drawn into isolation. Relationships begin to break down. And I'm not saying that those things don't happen sometimes because we're on a positive path and we realize we need to leave things behind. But the stuff we're leaving behind should be more negative than the stuff we're going to, not the other way around.
Yeah. I think that's a very good test that you talked about there. How is this having an effect on this person, on their life? Is their life more enriched? Is there things going down the pan and relationship breakups? And so this is sound advice. Thank you. Well, rather than leave it on that note, we're coming up to Christmas. It's now, just a couple of weeks away. Or, in fact, it would be lovely to hear a poem if you had time to.
So I do. Maybe a poem is the way to end it. Maybe.
Yeah, that sounds great.
In a nice way. So I'm just going to share with you a little poem about an encounter with another presence, if I can find it. And this was an encounter with Saint Nicholas. So this was a little moment that happened some years ago. And I'll just read the poem. It's called St. Nicholas Dawn. On the 6th morn of the month that's dark, while walking in a hallowed park and breathing deep the icy air, I felt the grace of Nicholas there. I stood a moment in the frost and felt the yearning of the lost on land or sea who wandering go, whose minds and hearts are often low, as gripped within by sadness grey. They stumble through another day and long to feel the gift of light break in upon their inner night. Then feeling deep their dark and pain, I vowed to never come there again. Right then, I felt him standing there, all bright against the freezing air. A bishop robed in red was he, who looked with kindness upon me. Leaning on his gnarled staff, his beard it shook as he did laugh, and said in tone of deepest cheer, "Why, what on earth do we have here? A little friar out in the cold, whose failing heart is not so bold, for overcome with grief is he, for those whose lives in darkness be, and those who know the belly's wail, and those who sit alone in jail, and those whose hearts know only pain, and those who sleep outside in rain, and those who fear the stronger power, and those who nearer feel death's hour. And scarce he spoke, but I replied, "'Tis true, you see what lies inside, but what can I do next to you, who dwell above the azure blue, and as a saint may do so much to bring the light and healing touch of heaven's blessing earthward sent to those whose lives by pain are rent." At this his face it darkened then, as though despairing of all men, like me, who seek a grace to flow, but far too often still say no. When called to be a mirror through, the poor, the lame, the sickened too will see a glimpse of heaven's light that lifts them from the pit of night. Then as I stood before his face, he touched my heart and blessed this place, and said, "It's right that this you know, that saint I am, and saint I go throughout the world both night and day, to hear the cries of those who pray, and then I bring their yearning strong to him who seeks to right their wrong. Then sent am I by his right hand to all the hearts within the land, who gentled are by graces dear, and shed their sweet impassioned tear, that they would know their call is this, to enter into heaven's bliss, by healing, helping, lifting, raising, listening, watching, minding, saving, the weak, the poor, the little child, as I did here before I died. For this they call me Santa Claus, I who kept sweet heaven's laws, and now I pass them on to you, O little one, who now dares to extend a hand that helps and heals, and so the light of grace reveals, to let each poor one deeply know that Christ their Saviour bowed so low, that babe he was in frost and cold, our shepherd king who serves the fold, and in his mother's arms did cry for all the sheep, for you and I, and none he lost, and none forgot, not even those who choose the lot of greed and pride and selfish gain. For them he offered every pain. So come, my friend, and stand with me beneath the branches of this tree, and we shall watch the dawn arise, and light grow in the eastern skies, and pray and psalm and praise again the one who is the light of men. At this the old man smiled at me, as we stood neath the ancient tree, and in my heart again I vowed to cry to all with voice aloud, of him who loves us deep and well, to be a Christmas tolling bell that rings and calls both one and all to heed the ancient Yuletide call, to light each other's gathering dark and share within the healing spark that he first kindled with his breath, the one who broke the power of death. And as the light grew all around, I seemed to hear a merry sound of bells and chimes from out the air, of laughter deep that saints do share, and gone he was, my bishop bright, there at the dawning of the light, and I was left once more alone, filled with the song of heaven's tone that flames within my heart so bright, I fear not now no lack of light. So forth I went to sing this lay of the light that shone on Nicholas Day.
Oh, that is magnificent.
So there you go.
Absolutely fantastic. Yeah. Thank
Good
you
singer.
so much. Yeah, really, really fantastic.
You're welcome.
Well, and blessings to you for Christmas. I hope you have what will you be doing?
Aha. We'll be doing all the things most people do.
Okay.
But we will obviously have a lot of the liturgy, the rituals through. So for us, it begins the last Saturday before Christmas. We have what's called the Rorate Mass, which is a mass by candlelight in the dawn. And it's timed so that we start in darkness and end with the first rays of dawn. And that's in honor of Our Lady as the one who brings the dawn. And that's ourselves. We have that, and then it moves through with various carols and rituals over the days until Christmas Eve. And we have our Christmas Eve Mass in the evening, which includes the presentation of the child at the crib. And we have a very special blessing custom in the Franciscan tradition, which is it's called the Franciscan blessing of children. And most people think, oh, people bring their children to be blessed. We do that the rest of the year. On Christmas Eve, we ask the children to give us their blessing. And so we lead them in a ritual where they bless the community, because there is no stronger blessing than a child's blessing. And so we receive their blessing on that day. And then on Christmas Day, we do all the usual things. There'll be turkey and crackers and celebration, and we get a day off, which is a lovely thing. And we'll hopefully see family and friends and things like that over the days. So that's it. It's the sacred kind of midwinter celebration. We have the various aspects of the solstice. We can talk some other day about solstices and what they mean in the different traditions. But yeah, just to wish you and your listeners and watchers as well every blessing as well for Christmas or you or however you celebrate it. I hope there's light in the midst of the midwinter for you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's been wonderful to speak to you. And yes, it would be wonderful to have you back again too. And I'm sure there is lots and lots more that we can talk about. But yes, have a happy new year too.